Thank you, Rabbi.
Sure.
The class is dedicated today לעילוי נשמת אהרון בן קוקה, לרפואה שלמה בקרוב יוסף ישי בן דניאל מרים, אליהו הנביא בן טיטה אסתר, and שולמית צוליקה בת רבקה. Sorry. Thank you.
Bezrat Hashem. Okay. So Bezrat Hashem, like we said in the previous class, we're going to be talking about the miracha of ofe, it's called, baking. Now, this is the last miracha of the first 11 sets. So we talked about how there's four main categories of the 39 mirachot, and this is the last miracha, the 11th miracha of the set that's called Sidura de Pat, which is basically all the steps leading up to the final step, which is right now ofe, which is baking, which was where in the Mishkan they would bake the lechem apanim, and everything that we spoke about previously was to get to that stage. So the melacha is called ofe. Ofe literally means baking, but we also know it as, more commonly, we know it as bishul, cooking. Now, the definition of the melacha is preparing raw food through heating. Okay, so for example, we know there's different types of what we call cooking. There's something called cooking, there's something called baking, there's something called roasting, and there's something called frying. Okay, those are the four main ways that are called cooking in halacha. Obviously, we know nowadays there's something else called steaming as well, where you use the vapor to heat up food and to cook food. There's even bread that is made that way, but we're going to obviously be focusing on the main types, which is cooking, baking, roasting, and frying. What does each one mean? So cooking means if I'm heating something with water. So for example, we have pasta, right? We have rice is cooked, pasta is cooked. Other things, meats can be cooked as well if you're cooking it in a sauce, right? That would be fit under the category of cooking. So anything, if that's made in a pot that has water, that has liquid in it, is called cooking. Baking is if I'm using any one of the grains, like wheat, barley, oats, spelt rye, those type of things, and after I ground it, I turned it into a dough, and I am now baking. That's called baking. Okay, roasting is very similar to cooking, but the difference is it's done without liquid. So, for example, we have something that is seared, right? So the people, what they do is they take the schnitzel or meat or whatever it is, and they do it without any liquid. So that would also fit under the category of, or barbecue would also fit under that category. Okay, that's roasting. Frying, pretty self-explanatory, is when we are using something with oil. Okay, normally when it comes to Pesach, we differentiate between deep frying and if you're just using a little oil so that it shouldn't stick, there's a difference between that as well. So when we're referring to frying, we're talking about where there is oil involved. Okay, this was used in the Mishkan. Okay, the Mishkan, what we used for the baking, obviously, was.
Wait 1 second. I think, sorry, we have a question.
Sure.
In general, there's really not a difference, like with the malacha of how much oil. It's just
No, it's
It's
for
all-
Pesach, for the kosherization.
So that's what I said. I said for Pesach we make a differentiation, because when you're going to be koshering something for Pesach, depending on the use is how you're going to kosher it. So if it's something that is usually deep fried, it's considered like it's cooking, so then you're going to be able to cook, you're going to be able to kosher it with agara. But if it's something that is only used for searing, and then you use only a tiny bit of oil that it shouldn't stick, so then you're going to need libun, you're going to need to like blowtorch it. Okay, but Be'ezrat Hashem, when we get to the laws of Pesach, when we got to the laws of koshering, with Be'ezrat Hashem, we're going to go into it a lot more in detail. Okay, but yes, you're right. For Shabbat itself, it doesn't really make a difference, although we will see that there is a small difference. There is a small difference, Be'ezrat Hashem. Okay, so like we said, that in the Mishkan, it was used, the melacha of Ofeh was used to make lechem apanim, okay, make the showbread, it's called in English, and it was also used to cook the dyes. So the way they would use it, obviously we know that when we get wool is usually white, okay, or depending on the color of the sheep, sometimes it can be a little bit brown, sometimes it can be also the black sheep, right? But it's more or less a solid color. And then what would they have to do, and this is the menachot that we're going to come along, is we see that they would have to dye the wool into a certain color. So you cook the dye, and then you used it, and then you put the wool inside, and that's what cooks. That's the cooking that they would do in the Mishkan. Now, in this, when the Shulchan Aruch brings down or when he starts the halachot of Bishul, this is technically something that we should have mentioned all the way in the beginning of Shabbat, but this is something that the Shulchan Aruch brings down in regards to the Bishul, when he starts talking about Bishul, is a concept of what happens when a Jew does something for us on Shabbat. Okay, so for example, you have a Jew that's not Shomer Shabbat that cooks on Shabbat. Okay, so if a non-Jew does it, leaving aside the problem of Bishul Akum, normally we say that if a non-Jew does something for you on Shabbat, you have to wait till after Shabbat, the amount of time that it takes to have done it. Okay, so let's say the given melacha, okay, in order to not get into problems of bishul, a person, he has a very important business meeting right after Shabbat, so he tells the non-Jewish cleaning lady, I want you to iron me a shirt on Shabbat so that I can use it right after Shabbat. So we know that you're not allowed to do that, because you're not allowed to tell a non-Jew to do something for you that you're not allowed to do on Shabbat. So what would happen is, if you would want to be able to benefit from the shirt that was ironed on Shabbat by a goy, you would have to wait the amount of time that it takes to iron it from the end of Shabbat till you can start wearing it. Okay, so let's say Shabbat ends 7:30. Okay, and it takes 2 minutes to iron the shirt, so you would have to wait till 7:32 to be able to wear this shirt, meaning that you would not be able to benefit from the time saved that the Jew did the work for you on Shabbat. That's the halacha when a non-Jew does work.
Tell the worker that they're not supposed to be doing that for you on
So
Shabbat?
yes, preferably you should be telling the non-Jew that they shouldn't be doing work for you on Shabbat. Again, there are things that they are allowed to do. But again, it's a little bit more complicated. We spoke about these things previously. For example, if they were to want to use the dishwasher to do the dishes, right? And things similar to that, or to vacuum the floor instead of sweeping it and lifting it by hand. There are ways. There are things that they can do. Okay, there are things that they can do that would be a melacha, but they can't do it for you. It has to be for them. So the case of the dishwasher, it's for them. Why is it for them? Because it saves them the time and the effort of having to do it by hand. They're able to do it by hand the same way that you can do it by hand. So if now they decide to do their own shortcut and use the dishwasher, that would be fine. The same thing for sweeping, right? They could sweep the whole house by hand and then pick it up and bend down and pick up everything with a dustpan. But for them, it's more convenient to use the vacuum, so they can use the vacuum because it's for their own benefit. It's not for you. But ironing you a shirt would be for you. There's no benefit for them.
The reason that they're allowed to do it in your home is because they didn't ask you, and that they don't need to do it later on, it's easier for them because they're doing it on Shabbos and they're getting it done.
So again, you're hiring them to do something that you're allowed to do on Shabbat. Are you allowed to wash dishes on Shabbat? In a
Yeah.
permitted manner, right? Okay. So
Well, you're
since
not allowed
you're
to
able to do what?
Not allowed to launder.
Yeah, 100%. That's why I said you can't. That's why I said the case of the laundry is not good. But for example, washing the dishes on Shabbat, you're allowed to wash dishes yourself. So you can have the non-Jew wash the dishes as well. Now, if the non-Jew, for their own personal convenience, decides, I don't want to wash the dishes by hand, I want to use the dishwasher, then they are now using the dishwasher for themselves. They're not using the dishwasher for you. So that's why it would be allowed. Now, the same thing for the vacuum. You're allowed to sweep, so they're allowed to sweep. And if they choose for their own personal convenience to vacuum, so that's their own preference. That's for them. Now, when it gets to the ironing, like I was saying before, when it gets to the ironing, it has nothing to do with them. It has nothing to do with the convenience for them, even though maybe it's going to save them time, Motzei Shabbat, them themselves. But since you're not allowed to iron, you're not allowed to launder, you're not allowed to do anything of the sort on Shabbat, so they can't do it for you either. Even if it's going to be more convenient for them to do it on Shabbat, as opposed to doing it later on, they still will not be allowed to do it for you, and you would have to wait the appropriate amount of time after Shabbat that it would take them to do on Shabbat. So like I said, let's say it takes 2 minutes to iron the shirt, so you would have to wait 2 minutes after Shabbat in order to be able to benefit from the shirt. This is the halacha when it gets to non-Jew. When it gets to a Jew, let's say a Jew did something for you on Shabbat, okay? So it depends on how it was done. So normally, regardless of whatever happens, on Shabbat itself, you can never benefit from it. If a Jew did something on purpose, meaning they know that it's not allowed to cook, and they went ahead and they cooked anyways. So if it's done what's called bimezid, on purpose, they themselves, once they do teshuvah, obviously, because if they're not doing teshuvah, then they don't care. But once they do teshuvah, they can never benefit from something like this ever. Okay, so a person made a whole, like, they did shechita, or there was already an animal that had shechita on it, and they decided to salt the animal. Now it's the entire animal, right? This animal can last for months because it's one big animal for a person. And in middle of that time, where from after he salted the animal on Shabbat, which you're not allowed to do on Shabbat, he did teshuvah. So whatever's left of that animal, because he did the work on Shabbat, he can never benefit from that. Okay.
Well,
There we go. So someone else, if someone else wants to benefit from it, they can actually benefit from it immediately after Shabbat. So let's say he did it on Shabbat, purposely, he knew that it was a sul, and then someone speaks to him on that very Shabbat, and he's like, you know what, I can't do this anymore. I have to start keeping Shabbat. So like we said, he can never benefit from this again, but someone else can benefit from it, and he can benefit from it right away, and he does not have to wait for the amount of time that it takes to salt it, like it would be the case by the goy. The same thing would apply if he did it by mistake. So let's say a person did a melacha, he did something that he wasn't allowed to do by mistake on Shabbat. He cannot benefit from it. He cannot benefit from it on Shabbat, but he can use it immediately after Shabbat. Okay. Now, getting back to the halachot of cooking, I'll just call it cooking, or I guess cooking is easiest, and that's gonna include all the types of cooking: baking, roasting, frying, all that. According to the Rambam, okay, Rabbi Moshe ben Maimon, he says that if something isn't fully cooked, it could be edible, but if it's not fully cooked, any additional cooking would be considered chayav. okay, is isul from the Torah, is asul from the Torah. So, for example, you have many people that like their steaks rare. Okay, you have people that like a steak rare. Now, a steak rare is not. I don't know. I guess a chef would have to be able to tell me this 100%, but it's not fully cooked. It's not fully cooked, and again, maybe it is, but let's just imagine that it isn't. So in that case, if you were to bring it from rare to medium rare, or from even medium rare to well done, at that point, says the Rambam, you are going to be a person is going to be chayav for cooking on Shabbat. Meaning, if you brought it any closer to being fully cooked, then a person is chayav. Okay?
Rabbi,
Yes.
maybe I'm jumping into something you're gonna approach after. I don't know. I need that. If that's the case, please wait to answer. But for instance, sometimes like in the case of a steak, it's something solid, right? And it's if you put it, for instance, like on top of a grill, on top of your plata during Shabbat, like on top of like something that is 5 centimeters high, higher than the plata. À la rigueur, you're allowed to do that, but still it could add a little bit of cooking to it,
So,
even
so
though
very
it
good.
doesn't go higher than
Very good. So that's actually exactly what we're talking about. I never really like looked into this particular thing of if rare is considered to be fully cooked or not. But let's say it wasn't. Okay, let's say it wasn't fully cooked. In that case, if you want to put a fully or a rare or even a medium rare steak on the plata on Shabbat, since it can bring it to being fully cooked, it's asul. Even
but
though at that point it's edible.
is it, for instance, like when I'm gonna add something on the plata on Shabbat, I'm gonna put like, let's say like a
A rack, a
plaque,
grill.
like that.
Upside down.
Yeah, or even like a mold of cake, but upside down. And I'm going to add something to it. Honestly, I never put a steak that was not cooked enough because that's not what we eat on Shabbat. But for instance, like roasted chicken. Roasted chicken has to be cooked because you have to cook it. But I noticed that sometimes the juice of the chicken dries, like the chicken dries. So it could happen on a steak.
Okay, very good. So yes,
Et
we
pourtant, ça
will,
mange
Bezrat
pas, il y a
Hashem.
Soledad. C'est ça qui est fou.
Very good. So Bezrat Hashem, we will get to that. That's something that will come up, Bezrat Hashem, I guess, pretty soon. And that's where we get into big differences between the Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. I'm gonna have to make a small disclaimer, I guess. Unfortunately, I'm not too well versed in the laws of Chabad, even though I'm sure that many of it is similar to the Ashkenazim. But I will be talking about Ashkenazim and Sfaradim more. Okay, so before we get to that, we have to understand. Very clear guidelines. When we get to heating something, okay, or reheating something, or even something that's already on the fire, there's very clear definitions of what must be met. Now, the first thing that we have to understand is that, let's say I have something that's already on the fire right now, okay, and I want to take it off and I want to put it back on. So I know in yeshiva we talked about a lot where, let's say, we had a chamin, okay, or we had a cholent. We had it on either the crock pot or it was directly even on the fire itself. Now, this is also something that we're going to talk about a little bit more, Bezrat Hashem. If we're allowed to take out from the pot itself while it's on the fire, while it's not on the fire, regardless of whatever it is. So we want to take off everything okay? Hello? Hello? Do you hear me now? Hello?
I think the people that were on Zoom, we can hear you, but I'm not sure the people that are in the Midrasha are online.
Uh-huh.
Let-
Okay.
Let me see. Let me
I think-
text Esther. Hold on.
I think they got off.
1 second. Let me text her.
Sure.
Sorry, Rabbi, we are connected to my phone because the internet is off here. Off. Rabbi is not-
I think he's out of the Zoom meeting right now.
Thank you so much, Melissa.
J'ai tout fait, je me suis allée à Caradine toute la négo sur les routes. J'ai
Dave.
reçu de Billy.
Do you have his
C'est pas- c'est genre
can you
pas de-
contact him?
Yeah, yeah.
C'est quand même
Oh,
mieux
Um,
que
Thank you so much, Rab. Sorry about that.
Yeah,
We
no problem.
put on the hotspot because the internet is down. Sorry.
Okay, no problem. Bezat Hashem. So like I was saying, so we have, let's say, a pot of chamin, we have a pot of cholent that we want to take from it on Shabbat, like Friday night, and we want to make sure to put it back onto the fire, so that it can also be hot for the following day. So this is something called chazara. Chazara is meaning we want to take something off of the fire and put it back onto the fire. Now, this is generally something that we're talking also has liquid, because if it's something that's completely dried, meaning there's no liquid, for example, a schnitzel, for example, rice, for example, potatoes, stuff like that, they're fully dry. There's no problem. As long as they're fully cooked, you can take it off, put it back on. There's no issues. When it's with liquid, that's when it gets a bit more complicated, especially between Ashkenazim and Sfaradim. So we're talking about now where there is liquid and you want to place it back onto the fire. You have to have 4 conditions. Okay. The first condition is it has to be fully cooked. Okay. If something is not fully cooked, if you take it off of the fire, there's no way to return it to the fire. Second condition, it has to be what's called yad soledet bo. Okay. Yad soledet bo literally in Hebrew means the hand is burnt by it, which is basically a form of saying that it's still boiling. Now, obviously, we don't want to like test it with our hands or with by touching it to see if it's still burning. How do we know what this level is? So the poskim talk about where it's hot. It's so hot to the point where I'm holding myself back from eating it. So sometimes when we take off the chamin from the crock pot, from the prata, whatever it is, and we want to start eating it, it's too hot, so we wait a little bit to cool down. That's an idea of what yad soledet bo is, where it's so hot that you can't eat it right away. Sometimes also the same thing applies to a coffee, where the water is so boiling, or a tea, where the water is so boiling as it is that you can't eat it right away, you can't drink it right away, you'd have to wait for it to cool down. That is called yad soredet bo. So that's the second condition, meaning it has to be fully cooked, and it still has to be yad soredet bo. Okay. The third condition is that when I take it off of the fire, I have to have intention of putting it back. Meaning, if I'm just taking it off the fire and then I regret and say, "Oh shoot, why did I take it off? Why did I take off the fire? I want to put it back on the fire now." That wouldn't be good. You have to take it off the fire with the intention of putting it back. Okay. And the fourth condition is that you're not allowed to place it down on a surface. So you want to place it on the counter to be able to take out with a ladle or to do something like that. You would not be allowed to do that. There are two ways around that. Either one, there's one person that holds the the pot while you take out from it. Or if you're not able to do that and someone else isn't around, what you can do is you can place it on the counter in a way that if you're not holding the other side, it would fall off. So for example, you put only the edge of the pot on the counter. So now it's technically you're able to balance it with your other hand and the small part that's on the counter. But if you were to leave go of your hand, then it would fall. Okay? So those are the four conditions that have to be met in order to be able to return something that was on the fire to the fire. Number one, it was fully cooked. Number two, it has to be yad soredet bo. Number three, you have to take it off of the fire with the intention of putting it back on the fire. And number four, you're not able to place it down on a surface. Okay, it has to be either held in your hand, or if you're not able to do that, like we said, to place it in a way that if you were to remove your hand, it would fall down. Yes.
Aren't you allowed to place it down, but you have to keep your hand on it the whole time?
So very good. So that only works if you're placing it down in a way that it would fall without your support. If you're if you're placing it on a counter and it's fully on the counter and you remove your hands, it would stay on the counter. Then the fact that you're still holding onto it doesn't really accomplish much. It has to be placed in a way that if you're not holding it, it would fall.
And that is to have the mindset that it's going to be returned really, really quickly.
Not only for that, because when I'm doing something like that, meaning when I'm assuring that I never placed it down on a surface, it means I'm not interrupting the process of the original cooking before I took it off.
It's not making it a more cooked.
There's no what's like called a hefsek.
Sick. Okay.
Okay.
First time
So
I'm
those are
hearing.
the
I feel bad.
no problem. So those are the four conditions. Okay, those are the four conditions that need to be met if you're taking off something that has a bunch of liquid and you want to put it back on the surface. Okay. Now,
Nice question. Does
Yeah.
that also apply for the Shabbat mode oven, or is just for the plata?
it would only be for a plata, not for not for an oven. For an oven, and this is we're gonna learn this in a little bit more in detail, Be'ezat Hashem. But for an oven, if you take something out of the oven, you can never put it back on Shabbat. Okay. Now, like I said, these four conditions are mostly if there is liquid, if it's something like a soup, or if it's something like a cholent that you want to put back on the fire. If it's something that is fully cooked and it's dry, meaning there's no liquid to it, okay, so then you're able to, even if it was completely cold, you're able to put it to reheat. Now, the reheating process. Let's put it this way, or this is something that you were mentioning before, where let's say I want to put it onto the plata right now. According to the Sfaradim, you do not need anything separating between the plata and whatever you want to put on. So I know you were mentioning before that you put like a small like tray or a small rack or a small something to be able to put whatever it is on the plata. According to the Sfaradim, you don't need anything separating. Okay. According to the Ashkenazim,
with water, like with juice.
so again, if
A tagine, for instance, I want to put it on Shabbat for lunch.
The sauce.
I will put the pot upside down and I will add the pot to reheat over there. So it doesn't get to the temperature of Yad Soledet Bo.
okay, so I'm gonna talk about that as well, Bezat Hashem. But technically speaking, again, that's why I said also what we're talking about is something that is completely dry. Okay, so we're talking about, let's say, challah. Okay, you want to put your challah on the plata directly to heat up. So according to the Sfaradim, you don't need anything separating. According to the Ashkenazim, a plata, according to some Ashkenazim, is okay. Like the Shmirat Shabbat Kilchata, for example, he says about the plata that it's okay, but normally they want there to be some sort of separation. So, for example, I'm sure many of you are familiar with the term blech, right? What's a blech? Where you have the gas stovetop, and on top of the gas stovetop, even though the gas is going to be the knob is going to be removed so that you can't play around with it. And even though the flame is going to basically be staying steady the whole Shabbat, you still need something else on top to differentiate, and that's what they put like this small that metal sheet on top, to show that there's something different. Meaning that the Ashkenazim, in addition, they say that in addition to the problem of cooking, in addition to the problem of maybe lowering a flame, which we're going to see very shortly, they say that you also need to have a noticeable difference from the way you cook during the week. Okay, so for the Sfaradim, we say in general that if a person is putting something on a plata, the plata itself is noticeable that it's for Shabbat, meaning most people, the vast majority of people, will never be using a plata in the middle of the week. Yes, there are exceptions, but the vast majority of people are not using a plata during the week for whatever reason. They'll only use a plata for Shabbat or for Yom Tov, which means that the plata in itself is already a differentiation in a way of heating. That's number one. Number two, what the benefit is also of the plata is that it's a steady heat. There's no way to change the heat. There's no way to higher or lower the temperature. Okay. Now, yes, there are hot plates out there, or there's sometimes, like, I think it's called a griddle, where you have a knob to be able to play around with the heat. Leaving aside the fact that it could be considered like mevasher because people cook on that throughout the week, which means even the Sfaradim technically would need maybe a heker, a sort of difference where you would have to put whatever you're putting on a rack, on an upside down pot, on something like that to show the difference. You would also have to remove the knob so that you can't play with it on Shabbat, or to make that differentiation where you shouldn't come to possibly play with the temperature. Okay, so that also brings us to the concept that we mentioned before of the oven. Now, since an oven, we know, is obviously used throughout the week, and even if it's on Shabbat mode, where now Shabbat mode, I can't play around with the temperature, right? That's the whole purpose of Shabbat mode. But the problem of mirzik and vasher, what's called, okay, where it seems like you're cooking, always exists. For that reason, you would never be allowed to reheat or put something into the oven on Shabbat, even though it's Shabbat mode, right? You can leave things there from before Shabbat to remain hot throughout Shabbat, but once you remove it from the oven, you would never be allowed to put it back, because once again, the oven, even though you're not able to play with the heat at that point, but the oven, since the oven is the common way to cook on throughout the week, there's no way to change it. There's no way to make it that there's a difference in the oven itself, of course, that there's a difference between Shabbat and the weekday. So you would not be able to do that. With the griddle, for example, that I gave before, there is a way to differentiate where if you're going to be putting the racks, you're going to be putting the upside down pot, you're going to be making some sort of hekel, you're going to be making some sort of noticeable difference. Okay. The same thing applies with the blech when you're putting the blech on top of the gas stovetop, right? So yes, you normally cook on the gas stovetop throughout the week, but since over here you're using the blech, and the blech everyone realizes and notices it's for Shabbat, that makes that differentiation.
If you
Okay.
were opening the oven to like get the challah for the table and it's on Shabbat mode, can you put can you put the fish in, even though it's fully cooked? It's
No.
fully, okay.
Okay, a question. I
Bezat Hashem.
something before Shabbat, but I'm gonna give you what I do. A piece of meat that I grill on the barbecue right before Shabbat, I leave it rare. It's not edible, but I put it in the oven on Shabbat mode before Shabbat,
That's fine.
and then by the time we eat at the table, it's exactly where it should be.
Yeah.
But if I fully cook it before Shabbat, then it will be dry and not edible.
Okay.
that-
Yeah. So again, so
During Shabbat,
that again, if it's before Shabbat, it's easier. Yes, you would technically be allowed to do it. Okay, but once again, you would never be able to you would never be allowed to put it back in, because at
Or
that
put it
point,
on.
at the medium rare or the rare point, even it's technically edible. Okay, it's technically edible. Maybe you don't like it personally. There are other people like it. It's at least at the level of machal ben dosai. So then it would be allowed. Okay. So like we said, when we're dealing with reheating something on Shabbat, right? We have to be careful of two issues. One, we're not able to play with the temperature. Okay, so that means if we have a knob for the whatever it is, we would have to remove the knob or cover the buttons. And two, it should not be something that we use to cook throughout the week, or at least we should do some sort of noticeable sign to show that it's different. And that was the example that we gave: the blech, the upside down pot, and all those type of differentiations. Okay. Now, it is forbidden to cook with a derivative of the fire. Well, obviously we know you can't cook on the fire itself on Shabbat. Okay, but we know there's also things that are still hot after being taken off of the fire. So that's going to be called the derivative of the fire. For example, a pot that was taken off of the fire, right? So it's no longer on the fire. Yes, it's going to be called kli rishon. But at that point, it's going to be still able to be cooked, or it's still going to be able to cook, and you would not be allowed to use that to heat something, or you would have to be careful of placing something in it that can cook. Okay, so for example, a person takes off a pot from the fire, and they taste the food, and they say, this is missing a bit of spices. Okay, so you would not be allowed to put the spices in. Salt, maybe yes, but again, better to avoid all those things. Where you shouldn't be placing any spices inside the pot directly. After you take it from the pot, then you can add the spices. Okay, but you should be careful not to put any spices directly into the pot. There is a way.
If you take it out of the pot, even though it's still, for instance, like you just took out your cholent from the plata, it's not considered still keli rishon?
Again, if the chulin, the chamin, the dafina, whatever it is already outside of that pot,
Yes.
okay, so for especially for the Sfaradim, we say that it no longer cooks.
Ah, okay.
And especially if it's salt.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Now there is a way where technically, according to Halacha, you would be allowed to cook 100% on Shabbat. And that is, and I know this sounds like a bit far-fetched, but it's been done before, where, and especially here in Miami or sometimes in Israel, Eilat, it can happen also very, very easily, where you cook directly with the sun.
Ah, yeah.
Okay. So, for example, a person wants to make sunny side up eggs or whatever it is. What they
Chayal
can do,
on his jeep, for instance.
what?
A chayal on his jeep.
My dad used to do that.
Yeah.
Yeah. So very good. So what you would have to do is, or
Yeah.
what you're able to do, is you're able to take the egg, put it in a pot or put it in a pan, whatever it is, and leave it directly in the sun. Okay? And then the sun itself is going to be able to cook the egg. That you're allowed to do on Shabbat. You're allowed to cook directly from the sun. However, you have to be careful that you're not cooking from something that was heated by the sun, which means, let's say you have your pan that is out in the sun for a while. So the pan itself is now very hot, and you want to put the egg inside the pan to cook. That you would not be allowed to do that. Why? Because since the sun heated the pan, and now the pan is what's going to be cooking the eggs, that would not be allowed. You would have to have the pan that is cold, and that you put the two directly into the sun at the same time, and then it's the sun itself that is heating the food, that is cooking the food. That would be allowed. Now, this um, this concept of being able to cook with the sun also comes a little bit into play when people go to Israel. I'm sure, like many of you are familiar with the concept of, and this is true mostly for homes, not for hotels, but they have a concept of what's called a dud shemesh, a hot water boiler. Okay, but it's only used, or it's heated through solar power. Okay, so they have a special dedicated solar panel, usually on the roof, and this is what heats up the water inside the boiler. Okay, so you would be allowed to use water that was heated through the solar water boiler on Shabbat, but you're not able to use water that was heated in a regular boiler on Shabbat. So, and that also technically applies over here or anywhere else, where if a person wants to use hot water on Shabbat, they would not be allowed to use hot water from the sink. Especially if they have what's called a tankless system. I know here in Miami we have many homes, they have what's called a tankless system, where it's water that gets heated at the moment, which means it's a system that when you turn on, or when you turn on the switch of the hot water, right away there's like an external thing that gets turned on that heats the water as it comes into the home, and the heating happens at the moment. It happens directly. So that's for sure not allowed, because that's cooking directly. Your direct action is basically cooking. So you would not be allowed to use that on Shabbat. You would also not be allowed to use on Shabbat a regular hot water boiler system, where you have the huge boiler in the home, and the water comes in from there. You would not be allowed to use that on Shabbat either. Why? Because when you are taking out the hot water, even though the hot water was usually cooked before Shabbat, but what happens is there's cold water that comes into that boiler on Shabbat. And then that cold water gets cooked, that gets heated. So yes, technically the water that you're using, it isn't being cooked on Shabbat, but since when you open the faucet to take out the hot water, there's more cold water that comes in, and that cold water is getting cooked. So you would not be allowed to use that on Shabbat. And there is no way to even like turn off the system. It's been tried before. If you turn off the system where the water comes in, then no water is able to come out. There's no real way around it. The difference, however, would be by Yom Tov. By Yom Tov, you would technically be allowed to use water that was boiled before Yom Tov to even shower fully. Okay. On Yom Tov, the halacha is that you are not allowed to shower with water that was shower your full body, of course, with water that was heated on Yom Tov. If it was water that was heated before Yom Tov, you can shower your full body with it. So in the case of the hot water boiler, we know that Yom Tov we don't really have a problem with cooking, so there's no problem of the water that's coming into the hot water boiler being cooked. And when we shower, so we're showering with the water that was heated before Yom Tov, so that would be okay. If a person would have the tankless system, so then you wouldn't be allowed to shower your full body on Yom Tov, because once again the water is being heated at the moment. The water is being heated right away, and in that case you would not be allowed to shower your full body with such water on Yom Tov. Okay, if it's with a dud shemesh, if it's with the sun boiler, then like we said, there's absolutely no problem with that either. Okay, now when we get to cooking, and this is also true for kashrut wise, meaning when we deal with basal b'chalav and all those type of different things that involve cooking, there's three main categories. Okay, the first one, which gets divided into two technically, is kli rishon. Okay, we spoke about this briefly previously, where kli rishon literally in Hebrew means kli is utensil, rishon the first utensil. So the utensil that is on the fire or that came in direct contact with the fire is called kli rishon. So that would be the hot water urn. Okay, that would be a pot that was placed on the plata or on the gas or something that was taken directly out of the oven. All that is considered kli rishon, and as long as it's still yad soledet bo, we explained before what yad soledet bo is. If it's still boiling hot, so it cooks, it fully cooks, and there's an isur from the Torah to use or to put something inside of it. It goes as far as even some opinions say that if you're using a ladle to scoop out food from this kli rishon, if the ladle stays long enough inside the pot, the ladle can also be considered a rishon, kli rishon. Okay, so let's say you're taking out a soup and you start pouring out the soup, and for whatever reason you get called away, you leave the ladle inside the pot together with the soup, and you come back a few minutes later, and now you want to put some spices inside the ladle, not inside the pot. Obviously we said no, but you want to put something in the ladle, you would not be allowed to do that. Okay, because kli rishon cooks. Now there's kli rishon al ha'esh, and that's what I was saying, the first one gets divided into two. It's kli rishon al ha'esh and kli rishon she'eviro me'al ha'esh. The kli rishon while it's still on the fire, and the kli rishon that's off the fire. Obviously, if it's on the fire, there's nothing what to talk about. We're talking about everything that we mentioned about kli rishon is only if it's off of the fire. Now to the next one, there's something called a half step. So we know kli rishon, what should come next is obviously kli sheni, the second utensil. Okay, but before the second utensil, there is a half step called irui mikli rishon. Irui is pouring from the first utensil. So we mentioned briefly before in previous classes that if a person wants to pour from a hot water urn, okay, directly onto something, there would be a problem of cooking. Okay, why? Because when we pour from, as long as there's a steady stream connecting the hot water from the urn to whatever it's being poured on, we say that it's able to cook. However, it's only able to cook a peel worth, meaning, like, let's say, for example, you have an apple peel, you have a potato peel, you have all those things. That's what it can cook. It obviously can't cook a lot because it's being poured out of the first utensil, but it's still able to cook a peel, and that would be asul. There are opinions that say that this cooking that it's able to do is on Shabbat, specifically for Shabbat, is only dirabanan. Okay, doesn't mean that it's allowed, but it's only a isul dirabanan, as opposed to if it would be kashrut wise, right? So, for example, you have boiling hot milk inside a pan, and you pour the the boiling hot milk like gets poured onto meat. So then the klipa, the peel of that meat, you would have to peel off a quick layer. You'd have to peel off a thin layer because that thin layer was now cooked by the boiling hot milk that was poured on it. Okay, so the same thing would be technically if it was splashed on it or the bubbles overflew and it fell onto the meat. So you would have to do kedei klipa, and if it's less than 60 times, so then we get it into more problems. But Be'ezrat Hashem, when we get to kashrut, we're going to talk a little bit more about that. So we have to be careful of also pouring from the kli rishon. That's called irui mikli rishon. The next step is called kli sheni, the second utensil, which means I have the hot water urn, which was the kli rishon, or even I had the soup that was inside the pot. That's kli rishon. All that is considered kli rishon. Once I pour it into a second utensil, that second utensil is called kli sheni, the second utensil. Okay, and normally speaking, it doesn't cook. Normally, it doesn't cook unless it's something that is very easily cooked, something called kaleh habishur. For example, tea leaves. Okay, so that's why we say that. Sorry, tea leaves is more this is more for Ashkenazim. For Sfaradim, we don't really have a problem of kli sheni. Okay, even though it's better to be strict, but there's no real problem with kli sheni. Kli sheni is able to cook things that are very easy to cook. So you'd have to be careful with that. Like we said, you'd have to be careful with tea leaves that you would only, for Sfaradim, you would use it in kli sheni. And for Ashkenazim, you would have to use even a third utensil in order to be able to use tea leaves on Shabbat. Okay, so far so good?
Yes.
Okay. There's a lot more, so I'm just gonna mention. I'm gonna recap what we learned a little bit in regards to tea, because I know we spoke about it. I think it was the last class, and this is exactly where the concept comes up. So I'm just gonna refresh and Be'ezrat Hashem, I think we'll stop with that and continue the next class. But the concept of making tea. So, like we said, or even coffee, there are two. We'll start with the tea to make things less complicated. There are two types of tea. Okay, there are the tea leaves directly. Okay, like, so take for example, we have mint. We have some people, they use Louisa, not all those different types of actual tea leaves, right? Fresh tea leaves. And then we have the tea bags. So the tea bags are less of a problem on Shabbat, especially for Sfaradim. Okay, why? The tea bags, and this is more the Moroccan than the other Sfaradim, we say that the tea bags, Rav Mesasi says like this. He says the tea bags before they're packed, or while they're being packaged, they are already kind of cooked. We kind of roast the tea bags, the tea leaves before we put them into the tea bags. So at that point, they are already considered cooked. So it's okay to be pouring water on them, and you wouldn't have to be careful with kli sheni, even according to Rav Mesas. Rav Ovadia Yosef says that it's better to be strict, and it's better to use it only in a kli sheni. Okay, so we spoke about like the second cup. You add the tea bag to the hot water in the second cup. For Ashkenazim, it gets a little bit more complicated. So, like we said before, for Ashkenazim, things that are easily cooked, even in a kli sheni, even in the second utensil, can be cooked. So, Ashkenazim prefer to do or to prepare before Shabbat something that's called essence, okay, where it's basically a tea concentrate. Okay, they take a few tea bags, they put it in hot water, and they let the tea bags seep into the hot water. Then they can fill up a cup with hot water, pour in the tea, like a little bit of the concentrate, and that's gonna do it. I know one of my grandparents, that's how they would always make tea on Shabbat. It comes out basically the same thing as the other one. There's almost no difference. So for those that are worried that it might affect the taste, it doesn't really affect much. That's in terms of the tea. So for the Ashkenazim, like we said, they like to prepare it before Shabbat, the tea concentrate. And if they didn't, so then they have an option that's called kli shlishi, right? Kli shlishi is the third utensil where they empty from the hot water urn. They pour it into one cup, and then they pour from that cup into a second cup. That now makes it the third utensil from the fire. Okay, then they can add the tea bags to that, and then that would be okay. The same thing would apply technically for coffee. Okay, so for coffee, it's less of a problem again, especially for Sfaradim, since the coffee we all know is roasted before being used, unless of course it's fresh coffee grinds, which we would have the same problem as the tea leaves. But again, so for the Ashkenazim, we would always prefer to push off a step, make it in a kli shlishi. So that's for the cooking. That's for the kli rishon, kli sheni, kli shlishi. Even for some of the Ashkenazim, those are the proper way to make the tea or coffee, and the same thing would apply to the sugar that's being added in afterwards. Okay, any questions? Hello?
Thank you.
Who's that?
Okay, yeah,
We're
I guess you got.
Action out is not,
Sorry.
but no, we don't have a question. Do you hear us?
I have a
No,
simple
yeah.
question about the mint tea.
Ah,
The mint tea, when some people tell me they prepare like a syrup before Shabbat and make it a water, like a syrup, and keep
That's
the
the
mint leaf.
concentrate that we were talking about. So
Right.
for Sfaradim, we can technically even make the mint tea. Okay, obviously we have to be careful. I'm not talking about if it's something that there's a suspicion of bugs or something like that. That's another category to begin with. But let's say there was no problem of bugs or whatever it was. So then for Sfaradim, you would be able to cook it in the kli sheni, which means you pour hot water from the urn into the tea kettle, and then only after the hot water is in the tea kettle can you add the tea leaves, the mint leaves to the kettle. And you would be allowed to use it like that. Some people, they want to be extra strict, which for Shabbat, when we're dealing with Deoraita, it's always good. They use it kli shlishi, sorry. So they're going to pour water in a cup. They're going to take from the cup, they're going to pour it into the tea kettle, and then they're going to add the tea leaves.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but
Okay.
again, if you want to prepare the concentrate before, that's also very good.
But the concentrated before, it tends to cool off the tea. It doesn't have its true effect of teaness because of the water being cold.
Yeah, yeah. So when you do something like that, yes, you would have to have a higher temperature of water, because if you want to add a lot of the concentrate to give it a full flavor, yes, it would affect a little bit of the heat.
The
But in
heat.
that case, like we said, you can do it the other way.
Okay. Thank you very much.
No problem.
Thank you so much, Rabbi.
Besimcha. Okay, that's
Have
all.
a beautiful day. Oui, merci
Bye.
beaucoup, Rabbi. Merci.
Thank you,
Avec
Rabbi.
plaisir.
Thank you so much.
Be'atzlacha. Bye bye.
Amen. Shabbat shalom kol tov.
Shabbat shalom. Bye bye.
Shabbat shalom.
Bye.